Queridos participantes en este seminario organizado por la Asociación Atlántica Española con el título OTAN 2030, Unidos por una nueva era. Vaya en primer lugar mi agradecimiento a mi colega Jim Townsend, presidente de la Asociación del Atlántico Norte, por honrarnos con su participación en este evento y, naturalmente, mi agradecimiento a todos los ponentes, quienes desde varias capitales de Europa y Estados Unidos han hecho un hueco en sus agendas para transmitirnos su valiosa experiencia y visión en los temas objeto de este seminario. Por último, a la audiencia, tanto la presente en este salón de la Asociación de Periodistas de Madrid, como los que a través de la red nos distinguen con su atención en el tema de hoy. El objeto de este seminario, así como del resto de nuestras actividades previstas en el primer semestre del próximo año, es colaborar con el Ministerio de Defensa y, en general, con el Gobierno de España en la preparación de la próxima cumbre de jefes de Estado y de Gobierno de la Alianza, que se celebrará en Madrid los próximos 29 y 30 de junio de 2022. A través de sus más de 70 años de historia, la Alianza ha pasado por etapas críticas en las que ella misma o alguno de sus miembros han tenido que superar retos importantes que han puesto a prueba su cohesión y su determinación. El conflicto de los Balcanes, el atentado a las Torres Gemelas, que fue, como todos sabemos, la única vez en la historia que se ha aplicado el artículo 5 del tratado, la operación ISAF, que fue nuestra primera actuación fuera de área. En todas ellas se ha demostrado sobradamente una capacidad tanto de disuasión durante los 40 años de la Guerra Fría como de cooperación entre sus miembros en la resolución de conflictos. El resultado está a la vista: el más largo periodo de paz continuada que ha disfrutado nuestro continente en su ya larga historia. Asimismo, tampoco es nuevo las dudas actuales sobre la existencia de la Alianza a raíz de la salida precipitada de Afganistán, sino que también recordaremos todos que en la caída del muro de Berlín se generó un largo proceso de debate interno que cuestionaba la necesidad de la continuidad de la OTAN, o al menos en su configuración existente hasta ese tiempo. Lo que en todo caso es indudable es que estamos en una etapa nueva, en la que el mundo está experimentando cambios acelerados que naturalmente afectan a su seguridad. Es un tiempo en el que los medios y las formas de acción de la defensa están cambiando radicalmente y que requieren una adaptación en profundidad que la Alianza ya iniciaba cuando planteó su concepto estratégico en el año 2010 y que alcanzará su madurez en el previsto concepto estratégico de 2022, que será presentado en la Cumbre de Madrid. Hace aproximadamente un año, el grupo de reflexión formado por expertos designados por el secretario general, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, para elaborar un informe sobre cuál debería de ser el futuro de la Alianza, presentó sus resultados de sus trabajos, en el que se indicaban las principales áreas de estudio que hoy van a ser cubiertas por nuestros ponentes. Al fin de conocer el estado de los trabajos, el objeto de esta jornada es, por tanto, triple: presentar los progresos desde noviembre de 2020, reevaluar el nivel de ambición de la Alianza e informar sobre el camino a seguir hasta la presentación del informe a la Cumbre de Madrid de 2022. Los temas de las presentaciones que vamos a cubrir hoy no pueden ser de mayor actualidad. Desde la resiliencia, que una vez más nos ha puesto a prueba como nación con el planeamiento y desarrollo de medidas de control de la erupción del volcán de Cumbre Vieja en la isla de La Palma, pasando por el impacto del cambio climático en la seguridad objeto de especial tratamiento en la cumbre del clima COP26 de Glasgow, o las amenazas híbridas que han estado con nosotros desde tiempo inmemorial, pero que su velocidad, escala e intensidad se han visto facilitadas por el rápido cambio tecnológico y la superconectividad a la que estamos expuestos. Las nuevas tecnologías disruptivas como la inteligencia artificial, las armas autónomas, el Big Data, las biotecnologías, las tecnologías cuánticas y, por fin, el uso militar del espacio, están todas ellas cambiando el mundo y la forma en que la Alianza opera. Por lo tanto, este es el esquema en el que nos reunimos aquí hoy y que debe de hacer que nuestro seminario tenga un gran interés para todos. En último lugar, permítame que concluya con una pequeña reflexión más de actualidad. El desafío de Rusia y el reto de China, que hoy están muy presentes con nosotros, y más que mirar la situación en Polonia o en Taiwán, exige de la Alianza una respuesta inevitable. Y la Alianza tenemos que pensar que sigue siendo el único y el mejor pilar capaz de hacer frente a estos desafíos. Y que el vínculo transatlántico sigue siendo la espina vertebral de la defensa occidental y de los valores que hacen única a nuestra cultura y a nuestra civilización. Valores de libertad, valores de solidaridad. Con esto termino mi breve intervención para dar comienzo a este seminario. Les deseo a todos que disfruten de él y que presten atención, porque estoy seguro que el nivel de los ponentes hará que todas las intervenciones sean de sumo interés. A continuación, el secretario general de la Asociación Atlántica Española, el teniente general Juan Antonio Castillo, presentará a los ponentes que nos van a acompañar en esta tarde. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias, presidente. En primer lugar, permítanme que inicie con un mensaje administrativo. Desafortunadamente, el primer ponente, el señor Peter Greco, desde Helsinki, acaba de comunicarme que no va a poder participar en esta sesión porque le acaban de notificar que tiene un problema familiar de salud relacionado con la COVID, con la pandemia. Y bueno, pues la conclusión es que vamos a adelantar las ponencias y para los ponentes les notifico que tendrán la oportunidad de, primero, extenderse más en su conocimiento y compartirlo con nosotros y, en cualquier caso, hacerlo con más tranquilidad y reposo. También dispondremos así probablemente de más tiempo para responder a las preguntas que indudablemente se van a producir. También a la audiencia, para presentar las ponencias, recomendaría que se utilizase la ventana que tiene la herramienta Zoom, abajo en el centro, que es la herramienta de preguntas y respuestas, dejando la herramienta de chat para las conversaciones internas. Bien, paso a presentar a nuestro primer ponente, que será el señor Michael Rule. Michael Rule is Head of the Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security Section in NATO's Emerging Security Challenges Division. In this capacity, he is also responsible for the development of NATO's emerging climate change agenda. Previously, he was head speechwriting in NATO's Political Affairs Division and senior political advisor in the NATO Secretary General's Policy Planning Unit. In these positions, he wrote speeches and articles for CIS Secretary General. Mr. Rule has published widely on international security issues in, among others, Asia Times, American Foreign Policy Interests, Comparative Strategy, International Affairs, Chatham House, the Journal of Transatlantic Studies, NATO Review, Parameters, and the World Today. He has also co-authored a book on missile defense. Mr. Ruhl is a frequent speaker on NATO affairs. He is an honorary ancient of the NATO Defense College and a recipient of the Star of Lithuanian Diplomacy and the Benemerito Medal bestowed by the Republic of Poland. Mr. Ruhl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss NATO's response to climate change. One of the reasons why I'm interested in this subject is actually personal guilt, because as a former speechwriter for 6 secretaries general, I've produced so much hot air that I'm probably responsible for half a degree of climate change and global warming. I apologize for that. So I'll try to make up for it now. Climate change, as all of you know, has become a central challenge that faces humanity. A study by the World Economic Forum recently put extreme weather and climate failure at the top of the risk scale, far ahead of cyber attacks and far ahead of weapons of mass destruction. And I don't think it's difficult to see why they did so, because the effects of global warming are now being felt around the globe. We have melting polar ice caps, we have rising sea levels, and above all, we see an increase in extreme weather events. So the challenge that climate change will pose to our security and to our resilience will be enormous. We will see an increase in extreme weather events, and this will trigger an increasing number of natural disasters, such as famines or floods. The political and economic stability, particularly of poorer states, will be put at risk. We will probably have less arable land, we'll have more droughts, and we will have more bad harvests. The result will be rising food prices, which will again hurt those countries that are already at a disadvantage. Rising sea levels and the desertification of large areas could trigger migration flows, and disputes over inhabitable land or over drinking water could erupt into military conflict. Then we have the melting ice caps at the North Pole, which could also create problems. Yes, it also creates opportunities, economic opportunities through the opening of new ice-free sea routes. But let's face it, we live in an era of global competition, and we would be naive to think that this competition would somehow spare the high north or other regions. But climate change is not only a threat multiplier, it's also going to determine where and how our forces have to operate. We have already seen that a strategic environment that is being altered by climate change poses challenges of a considerable magnitude. There's no shortage of examples for that. The changing salinity, for example, of the water in the Gulf of Aden has led turbines of NATO frigates to fail. In Afghanistan, helicopter engines had to be replaced because of the heat and the dust. It reduced their performance. Sandstorms make the planning and execution of military flights more and more difficult. You cannot predict anymore how the weather is going to be like. Then we have rising temperatures, for example, in Iraq, which put our soldiers under tremendous stress because traditional combat suits are not designed for temperatures above 50 degrees. Rising sea levels are endangering our coastal military installations. For example, the Navy base in Norfolk in Virginia, which is the host of Allied Command Transformation, is flooded about 10 times a year. A US naval officer put it very nicely. He said, we don't talk about climate change, we talk about sea level rise, because this is something you can measure. And I think he's right. And even military installations that are far away from the sea, inland, are not immune to climate change. We have extreme weather events that cause enormous damage to military installations inside a country. So all of these developments point in the same direction. If NATO wants to continue to safeguard the security of over 900 million citizens, it has to address the challenge of climate change, even if it is not the first responder. Now, at our last NATO summit in June, here in Brussels, we made clear that we mean what we say. We agreed an ambitious climate change and security action plan. And this action plan will set the stage for NATO's contribution in meeting the climate challenge. The action plan is structured along 4 themes: awareness, adaptation, mitigation, and outreach. And allow me to say just a few words on each of these 4 points. The first is awareness. NATO will undertake a comprehensive climate security impact assessment, which will examine the consequences of climate change for installations, for assets, for missions, and for operations. This will ensure that we have a common understanding among all allies of what we are really up against. We will also include the effects of climate change in our assessments of the resilience of individual allies and partner countries, and I'll come back to this. The second is adaptation. We will try to, wonderful English word, to mainstream climate issues into the full range of NATO's activities. This includes, for example, defense planning, civil emergency planning, standardization, military exercises, disaster relief. Our procurement policy will also not remain unaffected. Our procurement policy will take into account the requirements for NATO's future military capabilities in an environment that features increasingly challenging environmental conditions. We will also examine the impact of climate change on NATO's deterrence and defense capabilities, including on military mobility and on providing reinforcements. The third pillar is mitigation. In other words, the slowing down of climate change. We have to practice what we preach. We can't just lament about climate change and not really make a contribution to slow down, to mitigate that phenomenon. And that's why we have to find ways to make a sensible contribution to this aim. To this end, we will develop an analytical methodology for measuring military greenhouse gas emissions. And this should help allies in formulating their own national goals to reduce such emissions. The data could also be used to, for example, enhance investment and operational decisions for helping allies to become more efficient, more generally. And we will also develop a compendium of best practices, of best national practices, which will support allies in sharing information and expertise on their national military mitigation efforts. The fourth and final pillar is outreach. This means that we will strengthen our exchanges with partner countries, but also with international organizations. Our partner countries feature many countries which are probably more vulnerable to climate change right now than most allies are. So it makes eminent sense to talk and exchange experiences. I'm pretty sure that many partners would like to cooperate with NATO on climate change issues, in helping us also to implement our climate change agenda. We will also enhance our dialogue with other institutions that have a major role to play on climate change. Of course, number one being the United Nations, but also the EU, because the European Union can legislate, which NATO cannot. The European Union can come up with legislation to bring its member states to reduce emissions. So it's very important that we reach out to these players. And we will have to also reach out to civil society, including, of course, the climate change expert community. Because if I want to know what the security implications of climate change are, then I need to look towards the experts who know, who make climate models and things like that. This is a expertise that does not necessarily reside in NATO, so you have to look for it elsewhere. It's a very ambitious action plan, as you will have already noticed. So implementing this action plan requires a lot of political will. But it also requires a political narrative that reflects the true nature of our efforts and does not raise false hopes about what can be achieved, especially in the short term. Because nothing would hurt our credibility more than raising expectations which we are then unable to meet. So again, that's why we have to be realistic, and this is particular about the issue of mitigation. Now, reducing military greenhouse gas emissions is certainly the most ambitious part of the action plan. And public expectations about making our militaries greener are fairly high. In fact, just today I read several articles about this issue in the context of the COP26 conference. Many allies have already made a lot of progress on a national level in making their armed forces greener, be it through cleaner biofuels in aircraft, submarine propulsion based on hydrogen, electric vehicles, or better aerodynamics. Military camps, we've done some work on this ourselves. Military camps need much less diesel fuel if we bring renewables like solar or wind into the mix and use computers to distribute the different types of power evenly. And we can also train our soldiers in how to be more energy conscious. In short, we can reduce emissions without compromising our combat power. Or if I may put it differently, modern technology allows us to be both greener and stronger. However, and this is my last point, such an outcome, which we could call a win-win outcome, greener and stronger, such an outcome cannot be achieved on the cheap. Military equipment, as you all know, requires many years of development. And then once it's introduced into the forces, it remains in use for several decades. And that's also true for new energy saving technologies. They have to be bought, they have to be integrated into existing national forces. They have to be interoperable with those forces of the other allies. And all of this will take time. Hence, we must not allow impatience to dominate the discussion. We must not allow the stigmatization of armed forces as polluters. Armed forces for the considerable future will use large amounts of fuel. That's nothing we can change overnight. Therefore, a view of the armed forces as a polluter, a view that basically says the mere existence of armed forces is a climate risk, and therefore defines away the existential importance of armed forces for our national and collective defense, such a view gets it totally wrong. Climate security and military security are two sides of the same coin. They must not be played off against each other, and we will make sure that this will not happen. Maybe if you allow me a final remark now that we have a bit more time. As the chairman already said, at our next summit in Madrid in June 2022, we will unveil a new strategic concept. In the concept of 2010, the one that is still valid, we made the first attempt to bring in climate change as a security problem. It was just sort of a half sentence. But nations did not really act about it. They thought that the subject is too difficult for NATO to tackle. 10 years later, 11 years later, the situation has gone for the worse. Climate change is getting worse. And now nations have changed their minds, and they have understood that NATO needs to play a role. And the Climate Change Action Plan is the manifestation of this. So unlike the 2010 strategic concept, which mentioned climate change, but did not generate any action about it, the 2022 concept will be different because it can build on an already existing action plan. So this time in Madrid, our words and our deeds will match. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rule. It's been a very complete presentation, and I'm sure it will raise up very relevant questions. Then, second speaker for today is Mr. Rasmus Hindren. Mr. Rasmus Hindren is the head, of International Relations at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Previously, he was the deputy head of a unit for defense cooperation at the Ministry of Defense of Finland. He has served as defense consul at the Embassy of Finland in Washington, D.C., and as defense advisor at the permanent representation of Finland to the EU. He has held several positions in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, dealing with security policy, defense cooperation, and planning. Mr. Hindren has a master's degree in international relations. He has authored several articles on security and defense policy, and he will brief us on the report to enhancing NATO response to hybrid threats. Mr. Hindren, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me fine. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this subject. And I have to say right from the outset that the previous speaker, our colleague Michael Rühle, would be much better in a better position to talk about NATO's response specifically. But I will give you an outline of the overall challenge we are facing with regard to hybrid threats, and talk a little bit about what NATO has been doing and what is the major challenge still lying ahead of us. I have a couple of slides with me, so I will share my screen just a second here, and I will have the presentation up. Actually, I think there's a technical glitch with the sharing. Would it be possible for you to share the presentation from there?
Yes, we'll do, and it will be loaded from Spain, and you just tell us when we have to change slides.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's go to the next slide, please. Right. It's a bit pity to always come back to the definitions of what we mean by hybrid threats, but it's just the fact that we need to have a common vocabulary for discussing these things, so that we are not talking past each other. And there are several different interpretations and definitions in different countries, but this is how it's seen, at least from our perspective at the Center of Excellence. So when we talk about hybrid threats, it's not a list of threats as such. It's more about the method and the strategy utilized. It's a coordinated and synchronized action, or several actions that target states and institutions' systemic vulnerabilities, and usually using a wide range of means. And it's an activity that tries to exploit the various thresholds of specifically of detection and attribution, and the various gaps and seams that we have in our societies, in our governments, between ministries, between the public sector and the private sector, between civilian and military, and so on. And the goal that the hybrid actors, the malign actors have usually is to disrupt our decision-making, disrupt our democratic processes, and also to hurt our societies. Next slide, please. This is going a little bit deeper on the problematic that we are facing here, and the response that we foresee is there in the title, and it's a comprehensive approach. But first, just to continue on the nature of the threat, this is, first of all, I would describe our current environment as one of persistent systemic competition. So we're not in a crisis, we're not in a war as such, but neither are we at peace. So it is an environment that is described by competition. It means that what we are facing, the influencing attempts and attacks we're facing, are often slow burning and slowly accumulating. One attack as such might not have any kind of strategic effects, but when there are 10 or 100 of those attacks, then the cumulative effect is much greater. There's a possibility of experiencing multiple crises or operations at the same time. Right now, our gaze is very much focused on what is happening at the borders of Belarus, and quite right. It's a huge crisis with potentially really large-scale effects on our systems. But at the same time, there are other things happening. There are things happening on the Ukrainian border. There are things happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina, things happening everywhere. So we need to be able to do several things at the same time. It's a matter also of being able to connect the dots. There might be things happening which don't seem to be related to each other, but we need to find that out if there's a linkage between those efforts. The type of influencing that we're facing is also, it's an on-off type of influencing sometimes, that the malign actor can escalate their actions up to a certain level, and then they might just draw it down. They might stop completely, and then they might suddenly turn up the volume again, perhaps in the same place or in another place. And of course, there's all kinds of distractions taking place, red herrings, so to speak, and we just need to be better able to identify the real crisis potential from the distractions. Some conclusions right away is that we need to have a good situational awareness, moving more into the need to share basis from need to know basis in our information and intelligence sharing. On the same token, there has to be a better cross-government cooperation and international cooperation, and this is of course where NATO also comes in. There should be a clarity of responsibilities, but at the same time a kind of centralized strategy and understanding of the tools we have. Okay, moving forward, next slide please. This is the final slide about the broader framework. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about NATO, but just to show you the importance of international cooperation and where it could actually take place. So it's a matter of building resilience, preparing on the one hand, and it's a matter of being able to respond, to defend, or to use countermeasures if necessary. And there are various ways of enhancing this resilience in cooperation, and there are various ways of responding together. Next slide, please. And the NATO's approach, which is very much based on this prepare, deter, defend logic, which is kind of quite nicely captures this broader idea of enhancing resilience on the one hand, which is the preparation factor, and then being able to actually bring some countermeasures to the table if need be. And the fact that we are experiencing hybrid threats in the first place, and that NATO is experiencing hybrid threats, is actually a follow-on of success in a more conventional sphere. So NATO has been successful, and our countries have been successful in leveraging the conventional and also nuclear deterrence to such a level that the adversaries feel obliged to try to influence us at a lower level of action, and what we call below the threshold of certainly of activating Article 5 and the threshold of kinetic action more broadly. So in a way, we are experiencing the situation which is a consequence of our success. But of course, it doesn't solve the problem. We still have the problem. We need to be able to tackle these challenges also in that end of the spectrum and below the threshold. So NATO has had a strategy since 2015. And strategy, of course, is critical, because this is a question of bringing the various tools, bringing the various threat perspectives together in a coherent, comprehensive approach. Resilience is a big part of that, and NATO has been working and finalizing resilience baseline requirements already several years ago, and there's a good work happening at this moment to update those and to make sure that they get implemented. Intelligence is another big factor. I alluded to the fact that it has to be a kind of a new approach to intelligence, more on a need to share basis. And NATO is doing a good job with the hybrid analysis branch in the Joint Intelligence and Security Division, for instance. Counter-hybrid support teams were established within NATO some years back, and they have also been utilized a couple of times. So a good concrete tool. Exercising is hugely important in this regard. And finally, and this is something I want to underline, is the legal tools that we have. It's a matter of having a sufficient treaty basis and sufficient national legislation to be able to respond in even surprising novel kind of situations. Now, finally on this matter, of course, there are certain things that are the responsibilities of NATO as an organization, and then there are a lot of things that are the responsibilities of individual allies. And this is the starting point, but where the responsibilities lie in a given crisis is still an area that could be further defined and elaborated. And finally, cooperation with partners. In this case, the EU being perhaps the most important one, with EU with its own tools, which are very broad-ranging, but of course lacking in certain ways. But also cooperation with others, not least with our Center of Excellence. We have a good long-standing cooperation with NATO. Next slide, please. I know that this is a topic that will also be discussed separately, so I will not spend time with this, except to say that this is a challenge. Emerging and disruptive technologies are a challenge to NATO and to the EU, because it's about challenging the technological superiority, which the EU and NATO have sort of grown accustomed to in a way. And the other related thing is that the origins of these technologies are mostly civilian, which limit the ability to control their function and usage. This is, of course, a threat, and we have to analyze how it's being utilized by the adversaries, but of course it's also an opportunity for us, and the key points there are, in my view, to have a good, solid long-term planning and integrated this into the capability goals. And then the challenging part is about how to connect the various policy sectors, because this has to go through technology policy, industrial policy, security policy, and innovation policy, and so on. So again, we come back to the need for a comprehensive approach. Let me move on to the next and final slide. and that's about EU-NATO cooperation, which is in this arena is critical. And there's been good work taking place ever since the joint declaration from 2016. The fact is that the agendas of the organizations are more overlapping than before, with EU moving into the defense sphere and NATO also taking on broader duties in some respects. So there's a need to keep rethinking that cooperation. There's a lot of support for that cooperation, but there's not enough substance. And of course, this is something we try to also support from the Center of Excellence. It's still a good window of opportunity that we have with the NATO strategic concept and the EU strategy process happening more or less simultaneously. And I would just flag some of the areas that have potential, including exercises. We hope to facilitate at least one, maybe two exercises between NATO and EU next year. Information sharing, intelligence sharing, there are some limits to that, of course, but it should be the basis for almost everything else, and that's why it's crucial. Resilience side, obviously, because NATO has been doing a lot of groundwork, but EU has some of the tools to enforce those areas of enhancing resilience in the allied states and member states. And finally, on the emerging technologies, not least because there's a need to combine these various policy sectors. So this was perhaps more of a list of the challenges that still lie ahead, but also the opportunities that NATO could take now on the road towards Madrid next year. So I'll stop my presentation here and look forward to the questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hindren. Now, though we had programmed at the beginning a break after this presentation, we'll move on to the next one, which is Mr. Mark Mattingly-Scott. With a 31st-year career at IBM in a number of executive roles, Mattingly-Scott most recently served as IBM Quantum Ambassador for EMEA and Asia Pacific team, increasing visibility for the tech giant quantum computing program and developing business opportunities. Previously, he was a member of the core team founded in 1989 at IBM to work on the fledgling World Wide Web, managed the team that built the world's first e-commerce platform in 1996, and led the implementation of the world's first mobile healthcare platform in 2006. Mr. Mattingly-Scott will brief us on the report on emerging and disruptive technologies. Mr. Mattingly-Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm although I have a very British name and I'm British by birth, I'm actually the German representative on the advisory group on emerging and disruptive technologies. I have both German and British citizenship. The realities of global geopolitics and Brexit made that an imperative. As many of you will almost certainly know, the advisory group on emerging and disruptive technologies was formed with the brief to give NATO the capability to examine how it approaches, how it uses, how it exploits, how it examines emerging and disruptive technologies. Not so much from the point of view that it hadn't been doing this right in the past, but that there was certainly room for some optimization, certainly some room to do things differently and improve. As a group, we are 12 people from a selection of the NATO member states, and we've spent the last almost 2 years now, putting together a set of policies around emerging and disruptive technologies. And a couple of those were adopted at the recent council meeting earlier this year. The key science and technology domains that we examined and identified were around advances in machine learning, artificial intelligence, in the design, use, exploitation of biological and synthetic materials, in the area of computer-enabled hardware, so Internet of Things and robotics, in the area of data security, and of course, in an area that is very dear to my heart, harnessing the quantum scale, harnessing quantum mechanics. So there's an ongoing translation of knowledge gained from the study of quantum processes to getting to usable quantum-enabled technologies such as quantum computers, quantum sensors, quantum cryptographic systems, and the manipulation and development of materials at the quantum scale. The socio-technical context of our work was determined by our acknowledgement that the continued proliferation of cyber-physical systems will proceed apace. Computing systems will directly affect change in the physical world and evolve autonomously through the use of sensing and data. And advances in that autonomy and the ubiquity of high-speed communications and other advances will rapidly drive human-machine teaming. And we are seeing this already in the area of robotic weapon systems. The rising communication platforms and the importance of data transactions will also simultaneously motivate citizen expectations concerning digital inclusion and isolation, and the needs for protecting personal digital assets, including private data and private computing tools. The battles for resources, which we have begun to see in its first manifestations throughout the globe, is only going to get more and more acute. The struggle for the classically defined resources, water, food, energy, raw materials, will continue to grow and heighten, exacerbated by climate change. And data as a resource will add a significant new stress dimension to these pre-existing drivers of conflict, creating and reinforcing global asymmetries, both in opportunity and prosperity. The concept of geographic data pooling has the potential to create data poverty in the world. We're already seeing this beginning. Data gathering without rights and consent has the potential to create optimal conditions for data exploitation. And at least one of the NATO unfriendly nations is very, very good at this. The insights gained from a data analysis risk raising increasing disadvantage when it comes to assessing more conventional resources. And these conditions are likely to precipitate digital and physical conflicts. And in fact, we're seeing this already over data and data systems in the future. So we are embracing or encountering the idea of a cyber-physical conflict. Most importantly, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the business, talent and competence will be the human resource of global value and of key strategic importance. And it's very important that allied and partner countries need to be positioned and shaped to attract, develop, and retain such challenge. Common international rules and regulations on the transfer, use, and access to data and technologies will shape the alliances and trust in the age of digitization. And the active role of NATO in the discussion on international policy will be key for the security and peace among the allies. And NATO must establish itself as a recognizable thought leader amongst technology literate. That means engaging with both civil and defense applications and institutes across both public and private domains. NATO also needs to lead a mission to use emerging and disruptive technologies to defend the ideals, ethics, and norms of a free, open, and tolerant and transparent society. that seek to protect human dignity and diversity. This is a shift, perhaps, in the emphasis of NATO, but one that the advisory group sees as of key importance, long-term strategic importance. Emerging and disruptive technologies also, however, bring the risk of significant erosion of these ideals if they're misused. Keeping pace with emerging and disruptive technologies necessitates an agility and rapid iteration with respect to the development and experimentation of those technologies. And these aspects in turn form part of a wider innovation life cycle that incorporates requirement elicitation, ideation, technology translation, and technology transfer. So moving research to implementation, involving the active and passive participation of numerous stakeholders. NATO must expend efforts to ensure that such stakeholders' networks are optimized with respect to the efficiency and effectiveness in order to augment its aspirations for peace. In this regard, NATO's extant structures, such as the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, this advisory group of which I'm a member, the NATO Science and Technology Organization, the NATO Communications and Information Agency, Allied Command Transformation, and the Conference of National Armaments Directors represent a wealth of expertise, talent, and capability. And through these structures, the Alliance already has access to comprehensive state-of-the-art resources in science research, the defense industry, and strategic foresight. And these resources should be examined within the context of their architectural connection to each other, leading to consideration of how effective innovation networks might be composed through clustering, for example. Such networks should be well coordinated and have a strong focus on the development of utilizable outputs. The best practice in technology development across many allies often involves a combination of government, academia, and the civilian private sector. And NATO should proactively engage with these pre-existing innovation centers to understand their operation and assess how they might be usefully connected to its innovation mission statements and networks. And at a minimum, this linkage is likely to greatly augment NATO's ability to conduct and coordinate proactive horizon scanning, as well as to select optimal technology options for solving specific problems. In order to create a network of innovation centers, NATO should set priorities for affiliated centers based on NATO needs and NATO innovation missions, and collect, assess, and prioritize innovation concepts and outcomes from these existing centers. Specifically, we see the need to clearly develop and articulate a set of innovation mission statements accompanied by performance indicators to help shape and direct their activities. And of course, everything you can measure, you can do. And also to consider the establishment of a high-level cross-functional innovation working group composed of NATO's civilian and military leadership, external advisors from the private sector, and the relevant international bodies in order to develop this. On the subject of financing, NATO's strategy on emerging and disruptive technologies must include a review of financing and the role that NATO could or should play in this regard. And a well-developed and relevant set of financing procedures and initiatives will be necessary to allow NATO to play an active and influential role in any alliance-wide EDT innovation ecosystem. A key aspect for this is the consideration that NATO needs to have the ability to contract and fund at a speed and pace that is matched to the short turnaround times that are essential for small and medium-sized enterprises. This is a deficit at the moment, but it needs to be addressed. These entities are increasingly driving emerging and disruptive technology innovation, but as profit centers with limited capital of their own, engaging with long procurement cycles, and I can speak from the heart here as a managing director of a deep tech startup now since 2 months. The onerous and rigid contracting processes are very much an inhibitor to actually leveraging that innovation. NATO must use its significant influence to develop a more vibrant and active private sector investment environment for defense and security innovation. by promoting dual and multi-use technologies and providing very clear market signals relating to its interests in this area. The Alliance should also view the contribution to reducing uncertainties and barriers to financing for private or public investors across application domains as a key strategic posture. As an integral component of that ecosystem, the EDT advisory group suggests the design of an ambitious EDT agency in the style of the US DARPA program to create a NATO Advanced Technology Project Agency, which has actually been passed as an action item at the recent NATO summit. And the Emerging and Disruptive Technologies Advisory Group we're actually meeting next week in Brussels to begin working on both the personnel, so the skill side, and the governance side of the two recommendations that were adopted. NATO has to promote and participate the so-called triple helix centers among the allies, and to network these centers to establish a broad, comprehensive, and inclusive external EDT structure. This ecosystem component should act to augment NATO's thought leadership, horizon scanning, and talent development, and especially the development of education capabilities in the STEM subjects. The final word on the recommendations we made, we looked at the establishment of a NATO investment bank. And in fact, this has led to the idea of a NATO-based or NATO-backed venture fund. And this finance organization, this finance entity, is necessary because it needs to provide the seed and investment capital for small, medium businesses, for the private sector to interact with and have the flexibility to interact with NATO partners and develop business models and solutions which meet those requirements. And that may be using subsidies, seed capital, grants, prizes. There are in fact a number of very effective and well-run similar organizations in the European Union and of course the rest of the world. The European Investment Bank, for example, on the European Investment Council are just examples of that. This fund, this financing entity would develop a portfolio of ownership spanning products and solutions with equity and IP investments, and it would be able to perhaps also grant licenses for commercialization. So in conclusion, I think it's key that also that we acknowledge that there's a lot of synergy and a lot of leverage that can be brought, particularly through the European Union, but also through other supranational regional organizations. The European Union is particularly well positioned here. So a very close cooperation with both the EU and the core European country national organizations, and an explicit connection to the European Innovation Council, the European Defence Fund, and the other digital investment programs, such as Digital Europe, would be of great benefit. Thank you for your attention, and I'll rest at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mattingly-Scott. And now we will give entrance to the recorded intervention of Ambassador Sorin Dumitru Ducaru. Ambassador Sorin Dumitru Ducaru is the director of the European Union Salary Center since June 2019. He has previously held the position of NATO Assistant Secretary General and head of the NATO Emerging Security Challenges Division. He is fully qualified by his degrees in previous studies, and he is the honorary chairman of the scientific board of the New Strategy Center, European Council of Foreign Relations member, advisory member of Digital Society Institute, the NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, a special advisor to the Global Commission of the Stability of Cyberspace, and former senior fellow of the Hudson Institute. He has several awards, and well, he will brief us on the status, space as an operational environment. Could you please replay the recorded speech?
Hello, I'm Ambassador Sorin Ducaru, former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges and currently the Director of the European Union Satellite Center. It is indeed a great pleasure to address the Atlantic Treaty Associations, and I'm doing it not in an official capacity, but that of an expert who has been always interested in aspects like the impact of new technologies upon security, and has been working in the field of emerging security challenges, in particular with regard to cyberspace and now currently outer space. My intention is to present and have a analysis, focused analysis on the concerns related to outer space vulnerability and threats. Let me start by highlighting that probably over 60% of our personal, social, professional life, of our economies depend nowadays upon space assets. Our security and defense, the military planning, also depends on the space assets. And by the way, this dependence is growing more and more, and it's fueled by what I would call technological gold rush in both the outer space and digital space or cyber space. The rush is given by this unprecedented technological developments with regard to big data management, artificial intelligence, and in the future quantum computing with regard to the digital domain, and by the increased I would say technological development in space sensors, in their quality, reliability, resolution, and also the decrease in the price and costs of having access to such technologies. Our dependence of space assets is reflected at least in three domains, or has at least three key applications. And by the way, the gold related to this gold rush are exactly the applications, the growing number and growing sophistication and utility of applications related to space. The three categories of applications are telecommunications, then geolocations, like famous GPS or European Galileo, and the third one, Earth observations. This is a very dynamic environment which is changing, fueled by new technological opportunities. Telecommunications, especially in the past, was focused on satellites in higher orbits, placed in such a way that they would cover communications via satellite over the whole planet. But nowadays we see technologies implying internet communications in low orbit, 400, 500, 600 kilometers, that would allow faster internet communications than fiber optics, and full coverage of the whole Earth, or most of the Earth. Similar developments are in the field of geolocation. The possibility to track movements on the air, or location on the air, with a error of just centimeters as compared to meters in the past. And when we speak about Earth observations, which can be done both through electro-optical but also radar satellites, synthetic aperture radar satellites, the number of applications in this field are booming, from monitoring developments on Earth linked to climate change, for example, possibility to monitor traffic, support agriculture, or aspects related to environmental crime, and of course, last but not least, support security and defense with the use of such space assets, such space sensors. And interestingly enough, the pandemic, which has absorbed our lives over more than 1.5 years, has been actually amplifying the utility of space sensors, and actually amplifying also the technological developments in the field. Now let's move to vulnerabilities and threats in space. I would say that the concern over vulnerability of space assets is not new. It was linked initially to their reliability of technology, and the concern for potential accidents in space. Furthermore, the recognition of the dangers of space debris, and the fact that any unwanted accident or collision in space generates an exponential growth of such debris, indeed can impact the functionality of such assets, has been already a long-standing concern. But this concern, until recently, was focused on safety and sustainability aspects related to space. It was indeed recognized that space is a congested domain, with more and more satellites sent into orbit, and also some of the negative effect generated by some collisions in space. That concern has generated focus in a number of countries in the US, but also in the European Union, with regard to the issue of space surveillance and tracking, or space situational awareness. And of course, there is a tendency to develop this domain into what would be called, or should be called, space traffic management. The main focus until now of this function was indeed related to mitigating accidental collisions or dysfunctionalities, mitigating vulnerabilities that would come from such situation. The more recent concern, the concerns over the last years, has grown also with regard to threats in cyberspace. So those concerns that would come from, I would say, specific targeting of space assets. Why? Because there is now recognition that space is not just a congested domain, but also a contested domain. Experiments of anti-satellite missiles that have been made in recent years by a number of nations, even if they have been made against their own satellites, so destructions of all satellites of a nation, but by that nation, they show capability to do something like this. And of course, they raise security concerns that would come from potential targeting of functional satellites through ASAT or anti-satellite missiles, let alone the fact that those experiments have generated tens of thousands of new debris in space that complicate the situation of space pollution, if we could say so. There are other technologies like jamming or disabling via cyber means the functionality of a satellite, via lasers or electromagnetic means, or even spoofing or shadowing of satellites, bringing some I would say satellites that could be labeled as potentially aggressive entities close to functional satellites, with the aim of disabling them from a small distance. So all this has been recorded, and of course some of the most important events or concerns have made the story in the press as well. And this has generated this new concern with regard to the security and defense of space. And it is clear that this has to be addressed with, I would say, maturity, also in the spirit of preserving the peace, sustainability and security in cyberspace, and discouraging the negative evolutions. For security and defense organizations like NATO, the fact that since 2018 it has developed a space policy is a very important reflection of this concern of the new threat landscape that includes outer space as well. Also, the fact that space has been declared as an operational domain is another reflection of this concern. I, for one, had the chance and honor to work in NATO when the concerns over cyberspace have been growing, again in a context of a growing threat landscapes. And both cyberspace and outer space are domains with strong enabling effect, transversal enabling effects over the other physical domains like land, sea and air. But we see also potential of confrontation beyond land, sea and air, and that is exactly within these two enabling domains, cyberspace and outer space, which are essential for the other three physical domains. So therefore, I think it's important to be able to have in mind, including in the military planning, that the aspects of resilience, safety, security, and the defense of these assets is taken into consideration significantly. When NATO declared cyberspace as an operational domain, it was a clear recognition that the whole approach in military planning should evolve from what was in the past information assurance, so an assumption that the military planning can rely on assured information, to a mission assurance approach, where the assumption is that there will be some level of degradation. So not full assurance over the information, but there have to be lots of redundancies and the right planning so that the mission can be achieved even in such environment. I will leave it to the current NATO experts to present the measures and actions and also the future priorities regarding the security and defense of outer space, this important enabling domain in the context of potential increased confrontations in this space. With this, I thank you very much and look forward to have other opportunities to be engaged with the Atlantic Treaty Association.
Muchas gracias, embajador, especialmente conociendo su apretada agenda y los compromisos que le han impedido estar participar presencialmente en esta conferencia. A continuación, y compartiendo el mismo tema, tenemos el honor de recibir al teniente coronel John D. Patrick, con un largo historial y que voy a reducir en las calificaciones que tiene por los puestos que ha ocupado para dar la conferencia que va a dar a continuación. Lieutenant Colonel John D. Patrick is the director of the NATO Center located at Allied Air Command, Ramstein Air Force Base, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick graduated from Brigham Young University and entered the Air Force in 1998 through the Officer Training School program. He is an experienced space operator with operational experience at the 4th Space Operations Squadron as a satellite control officer and the 50th Operations Group Chief of Inspection Compliance at the Sriva Air Force Base. Following his tour at the 50th Space Wing, he was selected as the satellite operation lead instructor and culminated his Vanderbilt Air Force Base tour as the 381 Training Group Executive Officer. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick moved to the Air Force Space Command headquarters as the Inspector General Space Operation Team Lead. While on the inspection team, he again was selected as an executive officer. He was managing $1.2 million annual budget covering 1.8 million square miles, 7 countries, and 5 territories across the Pacific. After the command, he was assigned to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe as the only space functional expert who was charged with the development of NATO's space domain. He is currently the director of the NATO Space Center, focusing on developing space as an operational domain with NATO. He has several decorations, and he will complement the presentation by Ambassador Ducaru. Lieutenant Colonel, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the Spanish Atlantic Association for allowing me to share some of my experiences in the last few years while I've been working at NATO. In particular, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your kind words and your introductions. And, as I've listened to the previous speakers, thank them for their insights as well. In particularly the note about climate change and hybrid threats, disruptive technologies. Each of these different subsets or sets, space itself can help with some of these issues and challenges. It was very good to see in hybrid threats that space was actually one of the circles, and that we're thinking about that in hybrid threats. Same with disruptive technologies. As I reflect back on the disruptive technologies in the space field, we currently have some interesting developments when it comes to commercial businesses that are taking space into new and exciting different directions than they previously were. But I'd like to then reflect briefly about where we are in NATO and where the space domain was and where the space domain is. At the 2018 Brussels summit, NATO heads of state and government recognized that space was essential to a coherent alliance deterrence and defense, and agreed to develop an overarching space policy. The Council agreed, and ministers of defense endorsed the NATO's overarching space policy in June of 2019. This journey began in 2016 and was a step-by-step approach with a previous space support and operations policy, and that led to the overarching space policy and the declaration of space as an operational domain. The importance of space being declared an operational domain is that it was then on par with air, land, sea, and cyber for the planning and operational purposes. In it, allies observed that the space is increasingly important for the alliance and the allies' security and prosperity, and that the use of space was greatly enhanced allies and NATO's ability to anticipate threats and respond to crises with greater speed, effectiveness, and precision. It can be noted that there was a report in 2019 from the OECD report when it talks about prosperity, and we heard a little bit about the commerce of space. And that report identified that space currently, or in 2017, was approximately $500 billion, and that would increase by in 2040 to somewhere like $1.2 to $2 trillion space would provide into world economies. So I think over a period of time, that we also need to be able to defend and deter in those particular areas as well. The evolution in the use of space and the rapid advances in space technology have created new opportunities, but also new risks and vulnerabilities and potential threats, as we heard the ambassador talk just previously about these threats for the alliance and the allies' security and defense. Potential adversaries are developing, testing, and operationalizing sophisticated counter-space technologies that could threaten allies' access to freedom of operation in and through space. They're also increasing their own use of space, thereby extending their ability to project power over greater distances. Well, the NATO allies face a variety of security challenges. As the space environment, as we heard, becomes ever increasingly contested, congested, and competitive, adversaries are developing and integrating a full range of space and counterspace capabilities into their tactics, techniques, and procedures, putting allied capabilities potentially at risk. Alliance dependency on space-enabled data, products, and services was a key reason for the development of the NATO space policy, which led to the operational domain and has also led to the development of the NATO Space Center. These services demands an increased domain resiliency and interoperability to maintain its full range of operations, missions, and activities. With the development of the NATO space policy and the NATO space as an operational domain, the NAC directed that we do three things. Directed that we establish a combined forces space component or a theater space component, online with the air theater component, the land theater component, the maritime theater component, and the cyber theater component. One thing as we were developing policy in NATO, we didn't want to be different. We wanted to be operationally the same and relevant to the other existing domains. We did not want to be, oh, it is a space thing, go talk to the space guy. The NATO Space Center was also directed to be established, as well as the development of a robust space cadre. And the robust space cadre is critical for supporting NATO's core tasks of ensuring the necessary freedom of access and freedom of action for the utilization of vital capabilities throughout all domains. These capabilities are resilient, flexible, and tailorable in order to meet the needs of any crisis within the SACEUR's AOR. As we evolve space as an operational domain, the NATO Space Center will increase its operational space capabilities with a theater-wide approach, utilizing defense and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area, or DDA, the work that's ongoing in that area to ensure we are cross-functional, cross-domain, and not limited within a JOA while standing ready to support standing or emerging missions across multiple AORs or multiple JOAs. We are currently working on normalizing space as an operational domain. We are working to integrate with national space operation centers, as well as integrating with air, land, sea, and cyber across NATO and the NATO command structure. Integrating space with all domains and communities from operational planning to execution activities. The NATO space domain activities include a variety of different activities that are currently ongoing. We have just completed exercising in Steadfast Jupiter 21. We began exercising actually in Steadfast Jupiter 15 was the first time that we put space into a Steadfast series. That has increased over time from a few inputs to in Steadfast 21, where we exercised approximately, there was about 150 injects and about 300 to 400 products delivered throughout that exercise. But in addition to that exercise, we also do Rammstein Ambition, Loyal Leda, and maritime exercises as well. Nations are providing data, products, and services to include the space catalog, satellite overflight, GPS modeling, space weather, and other services to help come up with a recognized space domain picture. The space cadre are subject matter experts who integrate allied space activities within planning and execution processes and interface with the NATO Space Center and interface with other entities across the command structure. Finally, we're working toward a NATO Space Center that's 24/7. The civilian and NATO or civilian and military entities have 24/7 centers, resiliency and space-related capabilities. With a 24-hour capability, the NATO Space Center can react dynamically to changes in the space domain, whether through natural or nefarious activities, synchronizing with disparate national space operation centers located around the globe. And finally, we talked briefly about the theater space component or the combined forces space component. COMAIRCOM is the commander of the combined forces space component and acts as a principal advisor to the SACEUR. The combined forces space component ensures the prioritization and synchronization of space effects across all domains and throughout SACEUR's AORs and JOA, from BACO to crisis to UNLE. As the ambassador talked about in his speech, He talked about the applications of space and telecommunications, geolocations, and Earth observations. But we also know from his speech and recent activities that there are nations out that are looking to deny those same abilities to the NATO forces and to our allies and our partners. And so it's important that we understand this space domain just as we understand the air, land, sea, and the cyber domain itself. Sir, I know that we would like to leave a little bit of time for questioning, so I will end there and we'll open it up for any type of questions.
Well, thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel. As I see, there are no questions in the window reserved for that, neither on the chat. Maybe because we have been ahead of time because of the failure of one of the speakers, but we cannot stop waiting for it. So we will continue for the closure of the session, and we will remain available for anyone who wants to present a question to any of the speakers to send them to our webpage at the association, and we will relay them to the speakers and provide you with a written answer as soon as possible. Now, our president, Mr. Pedro Argüelles, will present the president of the Atlantic Treaty Association. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Jim. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
James Thompson is president of the Atlantic Treaty Association, and I'm going to introduce him to all of you. He's today an adjunct senior fellow in the Center for New American Security for the Transatlantic Security Program. After 8 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense, the European and NATO policy, Jim Thompson completed more than 2 decades of work on European and NATO policy in the Pentagon, at NATO and at the Atlantic Council. His work spanned the Cold War, post-Cold War political reconstruction in Europe and Europe's new challenge, including Russia and terrorism. Through his work, he has helped execute US military engagement in almost every conflict, from the Gulf War to the reintroduction of US forces into Europe to deter Russia. He also played critical roles in NATO enlargement, NATO reform, and helping to build bilateral defense relations with the new democracies coming from the breakup of the Soviet Union. Mr. Thompson has been lecturing in many universities through America and through other countries. He's been decorated by 11 European nations and multiple times by the Department of Defense for his work, including a Presidential Rank Award, Meritorious Executive. With all of you, Mr. Thompson, Jim, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I feel very tired every time I hear someone talk about the past few years because it was a lot of work, and I will say that my Spanish colleagues were some of the best colleagues I've had in the Alliance. But before I start, let me ask you, am I coming through okay? Is the audio working?
Yes.
Yes, it's perfect.
Oh, good. Again, thank you for that introduction. And also I want to congratulate the Spanish Atlantic Association for this conference. I think that many of us who have worked with NATO in the past, we know that we are entering into a very new period. the strategic concept that we will be putting together based on NATO 2030 and the reflections group and many discussions that are happening around the alliance. We know based on those discussions and based on the strategic situation that the alliance faces, that we are entering into a very unknown period in terms of what we feel we're going to have to deal with. China is on the agenda, for instance, and that was not something on the agenda for us even 5 years ago. We have Russia that is continuing its aggressive and bullying tactics, which we can talk about in a minute. But it's something that I know many of us who worked in the NATO enlargement days of the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, seeing Russia today is so disappointing. We were so full of optimism and back in the 1990s that we were going to see Europe finally free, not just from the Cold War, but from conflict. And now we see Russia once again causing anxiety across Europe in terms of how it is conducting itself. And NATO has to take that on as a task. And as we all know, in the last strategic concept, Russia wasn't even mentioned as the adversary that it is today. But even on top of those things that are more familiar than things like climate change, which you've talked about, then space, which was just discussed. We had the experience of the pandemic and NATO playing a role in dealing with public health that it hadn't played before in terms of helping allies transport patients or helping allies with procurement or this type of thing. It's a new era for us, and it's a new generation of leadership as well. We have to know that the generation that I grew up with, which was the Cold War generation, the Pentagon that I first worked in was a Cold War Pentagon, and so for me and my generation, many of you perhaps in the audience, we have to know that the playbook that we used in those days is not necessarily the playbook that our new generation of leaders are going to need. The next Secretary General, who will take the place of Secretary General Stoltenberg, who has done a fabulous job, as we all certainly acknowledge. His successor is going to have to deal with problems that come from climate change. And that's something that we have to deal with. And the playbook from my generation no longer pertains. So I think the conference that the Spanish Atlantic Association has put on this today has explored a lot of these issues. And I look on the ATA, the Atlantic Treaty Association, and its chapters, particularly the chapter in Madrid, is really on the leading edge of trying to get the alliance population understanding that this is what our future holds, that this is what a relevant NATO will have to take on in the coming months and years. And I think the Spanish people who listen and attend these events put on by the Spanish Atlantic Association will be ready and will understand when you have a Secretary General who talks about climate change. They will know why, because they have an Atlantic Treaty Association, and particularly the Spanish chapter, that has kept them informed and kept them on the cutting edge of what we're going to have to deal with. I think I also want to congratulate the government of Spain for landing the NATO summit next year. That's a big deal. And having worked at NATO for many years and working with NATO and working in many, many summits, it's not easy to take on and get approval at NATO to host a summit like Madrid is hosting. And I will tell you that this isn't, of course, Madrid's first summit. I remember very well, very, very well, the Madrid summit in the late 1990s, when the nations decided to enlarge NATO with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members. The Madrid summit was where it all came together. It was a big deal. And I was a young NATO action officer at the time in the Pentagon working on NATO issues. I helped get our team ready to go to Madrid to take part in those discussions and those decisions. I wasn't able to go to the Madrid summit because I was too junior, but I did get a coffee cup One of my bosses brought a coffee cup back and presented it to me, which I was very happy to have and still have in my office. So I want to congratulate the Spanish government and acknowledge the work ahead to get ready for that summit. It's so important. And it's such a larger NATO that Madrid will have to host than it was back in the late 90s before enlargement really took off. I think Madrid will be a fantastic host for the summit. I have been to Madrid a number of times, meeting bilaterally with my counterparts in the Spanish government, and I love Madrid. And I am very jealous that once again, I won't be going to the Madrid summit unless it's as part of the Atlantic Treaty Association. Then I will go early and stay late. But I will go to that summit if I get the chance, knowing that the Spanish people and the Spanish government are ready to take NATO into the future, because at that summit, as we know, will be the new strategic concept for NATO will be approved by heads of state and government in Madrid. And Madrid will once again go down in history as being in the forefront of major movements in the alliance. And I can think of no better place than Madrid to host such an important historic summit. And I think the Spanish Atlantic Association will be there welcoming all the NATO members and summiteers. The Atlantic Treaty Association, I hope, will be there as well, and I will be there if they are. And we together can put on events on the margins of that summit for the Spanish people and for others from allied countries and partner countries that will be there. And we'll need to understand the historic nature of this summit and of that new strategic concept that will come from there. I will make only a couple more points, and then I am happy to take questions or to do whatever you all want me to do. But I do want to point out that today's Veterans Day, November 11th, and we know that World War I ended on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. And this is a big deal for us in terms of memorializing that time and taking lessons from that time of carnage. World War I, it led into World War II, it led into the Cold War. There's not a generation, I think, that isn't touched by this last century that was so bloody in so many different ways. And I think for me, my lesson coming out of that century is that we have to do everything we can to make sure that we don't find ourselves back in that type of bloody relationship, certainly in Europe. And as I work with NATO more and more and more in my life, I know that having a strong alliance is the only way to deter bad things from happening to the allied nations and to the continent of Europe, to the transatlantic community. November 11th is the time where we have to reflect on that, and we have to rededicate ourselves, rededicate our commitment to working with NATO, to keeping our defenses strong. As a young man, I was the Spanish desk officer in the Pentagon for foreign military sales back in the 1980s. And I was part at the very end of that decade of helping to strengthen the Spanish armed forces with naval ships and F-18s. And so I know Spain is a very dedicated and committed nation when it comes to the Spanish military forces. I know that Spain is very proud of its military tradition, as they should be. And so I think whether it's Spain or other allies or the United States, we have to take on this day that commitment to make sure that we keep NATO as strong as we can and as relevant as we can. And I'll say that the Atlantic Treaty Association is part of that, because we will never be able to meet the commitment to NATO if our people don't. And our people won't commit if they don't understand why we're doing what we're doing and the relevancy of NATO, even in a period of climate change and pandemic. So I think for me, as the president of the Atlantic Treaty Association, working to revive and to reform the ATA and working with chapters like the strong Spanish chapter, that we have to link our arms together and help NATO make that case of commitment and that case of the role of a strong deterrent against things like Russia. a country that has become, unfortunately, our adversary. If you watch what Belarus is doing with Poland and using migrants in an aspect of hybrid warfare, you look at the Black Sea area in terms of the anxiety of our allies along the Black Sea, dealing with Crimea and what's happened in Ukraine, which are in their backyard, the militarization that we see there in the Black Sea, even in the Arctic, which I know is a long way from Madrid. But even in the Arctic, we see a militarization there led by Russia. We also know, and this is important for Spain, that whether it's the Mediterranean or it's North Africa, maybe it's the Sahel, there is a period. We're in a period of instability, and it has not gone away, particularly for Spain. Spain, looking south and looking east into the Mediterranean, has to face each day the instability that comes from terrorism that plagued Spain in the years past. Spain works with allies and partners in the Mediterranean region and in the Sahel and in North Africa, works with the United States very closely. Just to say, Spain hosts in a wonderful way the U.S. Navy in Morón, the U.S. Air Force as well. In Spain, Spain has a contingent of U.S. Marines that are posted there that work with the Spanish Army. When I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary, after the Benghazi problem with our consulate there, Spain was right with us to help us have quick reaction forces so that we can move and rescue U.S. embassies that are in trouble. I really want to express my thanks to Spain, to the Spanish military, to the Spanish government. Those decisions to host U.S. forces, that decision is always sensitive, and it's always very brave Spanish politicians and to make those decisions to allow us to host our forces there. And we are very grateful to the Spanish people for being such wonderful hosts. So whether it's Spain looking at the instability that we see from Russia and the Eastern Mediterranean for sure, the Black Sea, Libya, Spain is on the front lines just as much as Poland is on the front lines where it is, just as much as Romania is on the front lines in the Black Sea, and Iceland and Norway are on the front lines when it comes to the Arctic. We're in a very tense time with the Russians, and it calls for a NATO where we're unified and we're strong, and we understand that we've got problems 360 degrees around the alliance, and we have to face these together. And so I will say, and I will close on this, but I'm happy to answer questions. The United States and the Biden administration is very much involved now in trying, in terms of the United States, to rebuild our relationship with Europe and with NATO from the last 4 years of political turmoil in the United States. That turmoil is not over for the United States. As you know, we will continue to have our political problems and polarization in the coming years. But from everything I've seen, our relationship with NATO is going to be strong. No matter what happens, that has not really been the issue politically in the United States. Our relationship with Europe and our relationship with NATO has never been more popular than it is now. Although I realize the American president was not so happy about NATO in the past 5 years, but past 4 years, but we are now, with this administration, trying to go back and to repair relations and make sure that our allies and our partners know that we're committed. So I think it's, just to sum up, Spain is on the front lines. Spain has so many reasons to be quite proud of its military traditions, of its military capability, of its political position in Europe and in the transatlantic community. The U.S.-Spanish relationship is never closer. Coming from Florida, where I grew up, I speak on a personal basis how close certainly my state feels to Spain. And together at NATO, we're going to link our arms with the other allies who are on this front lines. We're going to meet in Madrid. We're going to have a new strategic concept. We're going to take on new challenges. We're going to recommit to maintaining this military strength to keep our deterrent strong. And I look forward to taking on all these tasks. And as the president of the ATA, I look forward to working with the Spanish Atlantic Association and my colleagues there, who provide one of the strongest ATA chapters in our organization. And that's something to be proud of too. Thank you all so much. I'll conclude with this, and I'm happy to go in whatever direction you all would like for me to go in.
Thank you very much, President Townsend. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for your very enlightening comments and encouraging view on for the future summit in Madrid. We all hope is a success for the alliance. It's certainly going to be a great opportunity for Spain, and we share your view that our country is well behind and committed to a healthy and powerful alliance, which is what the situation in the world needs and requires at this time. Thank you very much to all the other participants. They've shown great commitment and flexibility in adapting their schedules to our difficulties. And thank you very much for those of you who have attended this conference. And I hope you are as satisfied as I am with the results and the contents of all the speakers. Thank you very much to you all. And Mr. Townsend, if I can do it, I will send you an invitation to come to Madrid. Thank you.
I will be there. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.